I promise if we start early, I'll stop early. We were going to pick up on chapter 18, verse 19. But I really want to discuss a little bit about the beginning of 18. Because I want to talk about today about the irregularities, about the trials. When I say irregularities, I mean just plain illegal activities. And to go back, we can actually go back further to their taking Jesus into custody was illegal also, the time they did it. But if you turn back to chapter 11, verse 47. See, when Jesus had come into the city, everybody praising him, and that Lazarus, having been raised from the dead, it was causing quite a stir. People were following after him. Rightly so. That's completely reasonable. But look what the response of the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders. Verse 47, then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, what do we? For this man doeth many miracles. What are we going to do about this? Now notice they use the term, and the chief priests. Now isn't it a fact the law of Moses prescribes there would be one chief priest? And yet this shows that there are several. What gives? Well, by the time the Roman government came around, and by the time Jesus came to the scene, the Roman government had perverted the priesthood. They were assigning their own priests, and they would have them there for a time, and then they would just depose them and assign somebody else to be the high priest, because by that time it had also become a political office instead of purely spiritual. And so where there was one who was the real high priest, who was actually a descendant from Aaron, they were assigning him differently. So as there were still men that were alive that had served as chief priests, okay, under the Roman authority, okay. And so when it says the chief priests, they were all gathered together who had served, and we'll see this in a moment. So they took counsel, what should do for the man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. So that's their big concern. We're going to lose everything we've worked for. Yeah, that's right. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all. Now Caiaphas was high priest at that time. And it wasn't just that for 1 year. He was actually for several years, for quite a number of years, as a matter of fact. But it would just so happen that year he was serving as chief priest. He says, and said unto them, ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. See, that was the motivation. Don't you understand? It's expedient. It's useful for us that if one guy dies, we'll be preserved as a nation. And this spoke he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. He prophesied. It's interesting, his perspective. But if you look at Exodus chapter 28, verse 30, how in the world was he prophesying? Of course, you know, if he was really so removed from God and his disposition, how is it that God would still reveal things to him? Well, he was high priest, and this high priest was still valid, and God is faithful to himself. God keeps his covenants. And as we see in Exodus 28, verse 30, this is the command that Aaron was received about, all the high priests would do. Let's see. And as they had a part of their priestly garments called the breastplate. And, verse 29, let's begin in verse 29. And Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of judgment upon his heart, when he goeth into the holy place for a memorial before the Lord continually. This is a part, it was the ephod. They hang upon over his chest, and had 12 stones, representing each of the tribes. In addition to that, they had two other stones, the Thummim, the Urim and the Thummim. Okay, so they had 12 stones representing the different tribes of Israel. And they had two other stones, the Urim and the Thummim, and they would be indicators to answers to, as they would seek they would seek answers from God. They inquire God about various issues. Verse 30, and thou shalt put in the breastplate of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be upon Aaron's heart when he goeth in before the Lord, and Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually. Other passages talk about how the Urim and the Thummim would be used to indicate the answers to their queries. Okay, so this was still a piece of the priestly garment, and as he would continually go into the temple, like his responsibilities required him, he would still be able to inquire of God. And as it was, he prophesied that that one should die for the nation. In verse 52, and not for that nation only, but also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. Now, notice his perspective. We know the truth that Jesus Christ died for the sins of the world. He died to reconcile mankind to God, man having turned his back on God. And that was the purpose, and fulfilling God's purpose in that. But Caiaphas was looking at this, wow, this is an opportunity for us to take care of what's important to us. Our political desires to retain our nation intact and not be annihilated by the Roman government. And so he saw this opportunity, and in fact, it fit perfectly with his desire that Jesus should die, that one man should die for the nation. And so, hey, this man's the one. Let's take advantage of this, okay? And so it indicates how barren his heart was, how far removed from the will of God his desire was, being the high priest, and so his that they had already decided. Verse 57. Now both. Verse 57, chapter 11. Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment that if any man knew where he were, he should show it, that they might take him. They had already decided they wanted to take him to custody, but let's see here. The passage that says they had already determined to put him to death. In verse 10 of chapter 12, it says, but the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Let's see. The passage particularly where they already determined that they were going to put Jesus to death by this time. And this was not about Jesus sinning. We're going to figure out how we can get him out of the way. I can't find it. There it is, 55. Verse 53, I'm sorry. Chapter 11, verse 53. Then, okay, they just didn't go far enough. Then from that day forth, they took counsel together to put him to death. They had already decided, we need to have this guy killed. That was their spiritual disposition. They thought, we just need to kill this guy. And that was their whole motivation. So when it comes time to take him, in verse 18, this was all done clandestinely. This was not a lawful thing that they were doing. When you look at, when Jesus had, they'd gone to the brook, Cedron, and Judas knew about the place, and he took the band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, and they went there with, now notice, they come thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Why do they need the lanterns and torches? Why do you need a lantern or a torch when you go somewhere? It's dark. It's nighttime. In fact, they were looking for, they thought it was a fugitive. And usually a fugitive is going to do what? He's going to run away. He's going to hide. They thought that perhaps he was going to have to look for him. Where they were, there were also cliffs, there were caves, and so they thought that maybe have to seek him out wherever he might be hiding. So anyway, when they came to him, of course, in verse 4, when they came, Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, whom seek ye? They didn't expect this. This is, who are you looking for? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus said to him, I am he. Now look what happened. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood, where did he stand? Stood with, who did Judas stand with? Okay, the group that had come to take Jesus away. Why would he stand with them and not with Jesus and the disciples? He didn't want to be identified with them. He wanted to make sure that if they take Jesus, they may very well take whoever's with him. And Jesus didn't want to be around that. He didn't want to be taken as well. So he stood with them. As soon as then he said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. They weren't expecting this at all. And they're expecting to have to go find a guy that's running away. Here he was as bold as day, standing in front of them. I'm the man you're looking for. Here I am. And the fact that they stepped back and fell down, I think there's more to it. Why would they be so affected? Back in the old stories, the original stories of King Arthur and his knights, they believed that if there were a dispute, the knights could go to battle. They could joust, and they could go do battle. And of course, the righteous one would prevail, and the false one would lose. That was their idea. And to some extent, that carries validity, because if one has a good conscience and he's bothered because he knows he's in the wrong, he's not going to be as diligent and capable as if he had a. You've heard it said, it's not the man in the fight, it's the fight in the man. So if a man that's convinced, he's convicted that he's right and he's doing it's a just cause, he's bolder, he's stronger. And so these men, as they came to Christ, perhaps they had the idea, this isn't right. I mean, they knew this isn't right. And when Christ confronts them, of course, his being God, his being righteous, I mean, he had full confidence. Of course, he already, he knows this is what he must do. He must die. This is the way he goes, but he must do. And as look at verse 10. Then Simon, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant, cut off his ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So a minute about this, but in verse 11, then said Jesus unto Peter, put up thy sword under the sheath. The cup which thy father had given, shall I not drink it? This is what I'm supposed to do. This is what God has given me to do to save the world. Should I not do it? Okay. And so Jesus already knew he was going to die. And so this is what must be done for him to fulfill the will of God. Now note, remember Simon Peter having said, I'll die with you tonight. I'll go to battle with you. You know, he was convinced. He was full of zeal. And this shows it, in that he was ready to do battle, and that he took the sword, he cut off Malchus' ear. Now notice the detail that was given here. The point I'm pointing out here is that John is an eyewitness. He knows what he's writing about. Okay, he was there. He's an eyewitness, and this shows us Simon Peter, the specific person. He drew the sword and smote who? The high priest's servant. Now this shows that whoever wrote this knew who this man was. He was the servant of the high priest. How do you know that? We go further along, and that we see that John had acquaintances with the high priest and was able to get inside when they took Jesus inside for their trial, so-called trial. John was able to go inside. Furthermore, he was able to persuade the lady at the gate who was keeping the gate to let Peter in. So he had connections. And as we see, since he had connections, he would identify and know this one who was the priest's servant, and knew him by name. Look, the servant's name was Malchus. What is this telling us? John was there. He knew Simon Peter. He knew the name of Malchus, that he was a servant of the high priest, and he knew precisely what happened. He drew the sword. Probably Peter wasn't trying to cut off his ear. He was trying to cut off his head. He was serious about this. And as he was swinging, of course, the natural response would be, don't get hit. And so it was, and he cut off which ear? The detail, see? Which ear? Why the right ear? Because that's the way the swing was going as he's evading that blow. Instead of slicing off his head, he avoids it and gets his ear cut off, okay? Okay, so we see detail, the names, the events, specific. Now, but note what happened. When Jesus had said, put away the sword, then what happened? Then the other accounts say that Jesus reached up and he healed him. So, well, you would think that, any time today, it's a criminal offense to resist arrest. If a police officer is trying to take you into custody, you can't resist, because if you do, they'll charge you with a crime. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, so and especially if you get violent with that police officer, it's very serious charges. Well, here you have Simon Peter, slicing at this guy, trying to kill him. And do you not think that there would be charges brought against Peter for this violent resistance? But yet, there wasn't. Well, if you consider that Jesus healed this servant's ear, well, there's no damage done, is there? And so, if they brought a charge against Simon Peter for violence, in this resisting arrest, as it were, then the evidence would be, well, we got the ear here, and there's Malchus missing his ear. So the charge wouldn't stand, so they couldn't really charge Simon Peter with having cut his ear off, because it's not cut off now. Okay. So they are taking them by night, which is illegal. They're taking them on capital, well, it will turn out to be capital charges, but they didn't have the charges yet. You'll see that in a moment. And so they weren't taking him, anything that involved the capital punishment, they have to have the charges. They have to take him it's like we have our arrest warrant, right? There's a reason they're being taken to custody. They didn't have that. They were just taking him because they want to kill him. And they're doing it not only at night, which for a capital offense was wrong, they aren't doing it out in the public so that people aren't privy to it. And this was right before the Sabbath and right before the Passover. You don't do that for a capital offense. Of course, there is no capital offense really, but we'll see they're trying to drum one up. So all this, the activity is, and furthermore, they used Judas to apprehend him. Now this in itself was against the law of Moses. They weren't to use those who were, how can I say, that had good relations with the charged. Okay, and yet they used Judas, who was of the 12. He was their treasurer, and he had supposed to have good relations with him. They were not to use him in bringing charges against Christ, and to use him in getting at the one they were going to arrest. So everything about it was all wrong, illegal. Okay, as we get to verse 14, verse 13. So the band, they took the captain and the captain of the officers of Jews. They took Jesus and bound him. They tied him so they wouldn't be able to escape very well, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest the same year. So Caiaphas is the high priest at this time, but Annas was the previous high priest. In fact, Annas was the one who ought to be high priest. He's the one in line. He's the one that should be high priest. So probably he still held a lot of clout, and the Jews recognized him as the high priest. But by their political system and the Romans getting in and messing with everything, that Caiaphas was assigned to be the high priest that same year. And of course, in verse 14, now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So you can already see here that the cards are stacked against Jesus, as far as he isn't going to get a fair trial or a fair hearing or anything. Okay. And the rest is, look at verse 19 now of chapter 18. This is where we're going to pick up. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Now, what's this about? He's trying to gather evidence now. No, they don't have any charges against him yet. And this is, remember, this is the dead of the night. Well, not the dead, but it's what we would call Thursday night. Okay, this is the night that they took Jesus into custody. And so these events are all going through the next day. So the high priest then asked Jesus' disciples his doctrine. And so look at Jesus' response. He knows what Caiaphas is doing. He's trying to get evidence to try to figure out how we're going to charge this guy. And so Jesus answered, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort. And in secret have I said nothing. Okay, why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And so Jesus is saying, you know, I mean, you have, go ask them. And so he's not going to help Caiaphas out in what do we say, that putting nails in his own coffin? Okay. Of course, understand, Jesus knows he is going to be executed, but he's not going to help Caiaphas out. It's going to be, if Caiaphas is going to be illegal about it, he's going to make sure it's illegal about it. But look at verse 22. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Several things are wrong with this. First of all, yes, the thing is, you go back to the Sermon on the Mount. What did Jesus say about when someone strikes you on the face? You turn the other cheek, don't you? But what did Jesus say? In verse 23, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? If I'm telling you the truth, and it's evident I am, why are you hitting me like this? Okay? And so the fact that Jesus didn't lash out physically. Jesus taught when somebody strikes you, you turn your cheek so that you don't escalate the situation. But so he's consistent with his teaching. But what does he do? He challenges the legality of what just happened. Paul did that too. When Paul was charged with charges against him, he, as a Roman citizen, did what was legally right. He appealed to Caesar. If he were going to be charged with this capital crime, he wanted to be tried before a Roman court, not this biased small little kangaroo court down in Jerusalem. Okay, he wanted to be set before a court where things will be done justly, at least more justly than by the Jewish leaders of the day. Okay, and so as Paul used the law to do things in a way that would give him justice, Christ behaving quite justly in all of this. Okay, so notice it was this officer who smacked him by his own volition, by his own authority. He had no authority to do that. It was not by instruction of the high priest to do this, and so he did this beyond his authority, and as being an officer of the court, and not having the position of authority. So Jesus answered him like that. Now Annas had sent him bound into Caiaphas the high priest. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of the disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. So this is the second time that Peter is challenged. Previously, as he entered into the door, the young maid who was tending the door had asked him, were you not one of them? It's interesting to note that she asked him, are you not one of his disciples? Not are you one of his disciples? Rather, are you not? It makes it easy to deny that you're one of them. Okay, without putting it's a way you can ask a question without putting a person on the spot, so to speak. And so as they says in verse 25, art not thou also one of his disciples? Once again, put in the same way. He says, no, he denied it. I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did not I see thee in the garden with him?" Well, you'd remember that. If your brother, or I don't know, it says kinsman, if your brother got his ear cut off, you'd know who that guy was. And said, "Didn't I see you?" And so Peter then denied it again, and immediately the cock crew. What did Jesus say? 3 times you're going to deny me before the cock crows. And as soon as he said that last one, the cock crew. It sort of gives us an idea about the time of the events too. When do roosters crow? Yeah, toward the dawn. Okay. So, then led they Jesus from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So now, there are a lot of events that John is not reporting. So this was the Jewish trial, so to speak, done in the heat of night. There are other events that took place that reveal more illegalities of it, like when Jesus spoke about who he was and what he had said. Then they say, "Need we hear anything else?" And he rent his clothes. This is the high priest doing this. This was not allowed. But when they when they're bringing charges against somebody, the upper or the more senior members of the Sanhedrin were not allowed to exhibit this kind of behavior, lest they bias the judgment of the junior members of the Sanhedrin. And so the fact that the high priest is tearing his clothes in expression of lament, and such blasphemy, as he would sing it, this is biasing all the other Sanhedrin officials there. And that was completely illegal. And of course, this being done in the middle of the night, and everything going on like this, it was illegal. And they were pushing this through. Sort of like how some bills in Congress are pushed through. I don't want to identify one in particular, but some bills are pushed through because it's bad legislation, and they don't want it to be revealed by the light of the day. Okay, and so this whole court was being pushed through to try to get it done, and for capital offense, they don't do that. In the Hebrew law, the Hebrew, when I say Hebrew law, going back to the law of Moses. Now, you have the Pentateuch, the law of Moses, but then you have the other writings that are like commentary, and they deal with some practical aspects based upon the law of Moses. Like an issue comes up, what do? We have to make a judgment on it. Okay, what's our standard? Well, we go back to the Pentateuch, law of Moses, and that's the foundation that we make our judgments on. And so we write about it for these judgments, and so that's how precedents are set. But this was all that was done. The idea was to try to establish a code of law that is consistent with the law of Moses. Okay. There are different opinions about that, whether that be good or bad. But certainly, if you think about the foundation, should be the Word of God. I think that Jesus had revealed to them that they had taught as though it were doctrine, the precepts of men. And they gave more clout to the precepts of men than they do the doctrine of God. Okay. So now, as they had... it doesn't reveal to us what their judgment was, but it does tell us that they take... John is not right about what their judgment was in the Caiaphas little room. But then he does say they led him, Jesus, from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment. That would be with the Gentiles. That would be the Roman courts. And so they deliver him to the Roman courts. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. See, the Passover is still there. And if they went into the hall of the Gentiles, they wouldn't be able to eat the Passover feast, and they wanted to do that. It's because if one as I understand it, if one would not eat the Passover feast, he would have, or defiled, he could not eat the Passover feast. He had to be removed from their, they couldn't participate, so they had to go outside the camp. All right. Verse 29, Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusation bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him to thee. They don't answer. What's he? Why are you bringing him to me? What are your charges? And he says, well, if he weren't a bad guy, we wouldn't bring him to you. So he must be a bad guy, right? That's sort of like circular reasoning. Verse 30, they answered and said unto, okay, verse 31, Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. They didn't have the authority anymore. When Rome took control of the land of Canaan, it took control of Palestine, that Roman law now ruled, and that Rome allowed Israel to continue with their courts and their systems up to a point where they could not put someone to death without the approval of the Roman government. And so it was, they had to bring Jesus to Pilate in order to get him executed. In verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. So he's talking about raise me up. You're going back to raise me up and I will draw all men unto me. So he's talking about he raised up on the cross. And the Roman method of execution was, in this case, cases like this, was crucifixion. Verse 33, Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Now this is something where Pilate's trying to set him up to accuse himself. And so Jesus answered him, saying, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it to thee of me? In other words, is this what you believe, or is this what somebody told you? And Pilate answered, Am I Jew? Thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? So, sort of like when the Jews said, if he weren't a bad guy, we wouldn't bring him to you, but we have, so he must be a bad guy. Now Pilate says, well, your own people brought you to me. So what did you do? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. So basically, Pilate, the Roman government doesn't need to fear me. I'm not here to cause problems with the Roman government. My kingdom is not of this world. Okay, it's not like the standard kingdom where if they were, my servants would fight and there'd be a big revolution. Verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am king. To this end was I born. And for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is the truth heareth my voice. So he basically said, yes, but it's deeper than that. There's more to it. And that's, and so he says, Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he said this, he went out again unto the Jews and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. When I look at this question, what is truth? There are different ways that one can characterize this. Sometimes people have, when you're talking about truth of the Bible, it says, well, that's your interpretation, right? And that's what they'll say. Well, in the way that Pilate, being a Roman, grown up in the Roman system, the Roman gods, the Roman religions, and now he hears Jesus talking about the truth, they say, yeah, right, what's truth? So that might, in fact, today even, most people believe that there's no absolute standard of truth, no absolute standard of right and wrong. Everything's a matter of situations, and you determine what's right and wrong based on the situation. And that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches there is an absolute standard of truth, absolute standard of right, absolute standard of wrong, and of course, where does that standard come from? What's the source of our standard of right and wrong? It comes from God. The Bible comes from God. But there are those that say this probably was not that kind of a question. It probably was not in a scornful way, but rather, what is truth? You know, he's looking at things in a judicial manner, in a way as regards when they're developing a case, lawyers are developing a case. Two things have to be existent. Number one, there has to be an act, of course, but the act has to be. Is there a law that correlates to this act? If there's an act that happens that doesn't breach or encroach or break a law, then there's no legal aspects to it. Okay. So there has to be an act that is defined specifically as a crime. And then when there is, then they can bring a charge to somebody. And so in this case, Pilate's saying, what's truth? What is the truth here? You know, I don't see. And so when he goes back to them people, and look at verse 38. When he had said this, he went out again into the Jews and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. There's nothing we can charge him with. So what is truth? You know. So verse 39, but ye have a custom. So he's trying to appease them. He's in a sticky situation. And frankly, this area has always been a problem to the Roman government. They've always been problematic. And here Pilate could see that things could get out of control and bad reports go back to Rome about his situation, and he can't control it. So he's motivated now to deal with a way that tries to solve it without bad news going back to Rome. And he says, but ye have a custom that I should release you unto you one at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? If there's no fault that he can charge this man with, this is ideal. He does justice in not charging this innocent man, and he takes care of the Passover lamb, as it were, illustrates the scapegoat that was allowed to run away from the old law of Moses. And so he says, we have a custom, let's release him. Would you like me to release this King of the Jews? Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber, and he's more than a robber. He was an insurrectionist, and we find from other accounts. And so they say, not this man, but Barabbas. You put these two men in contrast, what would be the natural answer? You're going to choose the better of the two. And by all accounts, all objective accounts, Jesus was an innocent man. He didn't deserve to be charged. And so he said, which would you rather me release? And so they say, Barabbas. And by contrast, Barabbas should have been the one to remain in prison. But he was allowed to run free. And that's how corrupt they had become, that they had this mob basically had, we see in other accounts that the Jews had employed men of the baser sort to be part of this mob, to cry out, no, let's execute Christ, execute Jesus, the one who says he's Christ. And so in all of this, we go into chapter 19, what Pilate's trying to do to appease them so he doesn't execute this innocent man. And next week we'll talk about the kind of treatment he received under Pilate, and then the final condemnation. But I'd like to stop here for because it's a good break in the chapters. Are there any questions or thoughts or observations that may have? Okay. He was treated badly. If a man were treated like this today, we'd cry foul. This is unjust. This is a abuse of justice and no justice at all. It's like a lynch mob. It's really what it's like, a lynch mob. They had no intention looking objectively at the charges, they just intended to have him executed. And all of this to fulfill God's purpose to save mankind from his sins, to reconcile him back, reconcile man back to God. All right. Well, as I promised, I'll stop early. And so we'll see you next week. Actually, we'll see you this evening, 5 o'clock.